To Prince Villon, Toreador Sovereign of Paris. Your Majesty, it is my sad duty to report the murder of a kindred in your domain. The Malkavian Anton Duvalier, a scout in my service, was killed by a Sabbat warrior known as the Redeemer. My sources inform me of the infiltration by this creature into the catacombs of your city, my lord, and we moved to intercept, as I informed you earlier. Over the past few months, we have played a game of cat and mouse with this beast, until finally, we found him before he could engage in whatever dark ritual he was attempting. Once finding this so-called Redeemer, we quickly worked out our plan and launched the attack. The Tsamiti was a formidable opponent in its humanoid state, but it became exponentially more dangerous when it transformed into a monster, twice the size of a man. It was in combat with this monstrosity that my Malkavian scout perished, sacrificing himself honorably to protect the Toreador Ancia, Evelyn Berthier. Despite this terrible loss, the warband I assembled fought with great courage, and the tide of battle began to shift in our favor. Before the Sabbat infiltrator could be annihilated, however, he shifted into becoming a large pool of blood, which seeped between the bones of the catacombs in which we fought. Eventually, we were able to pick up the trail of this creature, and we followed it beyond the limits of the city until we lost track of the Redeemer in the wilderness. But there was a consolation. The trail ended at the forest of Halat, where the Redeemer was smuggled to the German Reich through the use of Wehrmacht supply trucks. But fortunately, we were able to discover a Sabbat agent working through the German occupiers, a caitiff called Hans Eckhart, belonging to an organization of the Sabbat known as the Order of St. Blaise. We captured this agent, who quickly agreed to renounce his loyalty to the Sabbat and give us any information we requested in exchange for his own life. It was a surprising attitude. My experience with the Sabbat has usually involved fighting with the worst fanatics I've encountered. But it appears that, in many ways, the Sabbat is not as monolithic as it seems. This caitiff has been a remarkable source of information in the brief time we have had him in custody. As part of this Order of St. Blaise, the caitiff Eckhart has a remarkable window into the structure and politics of the Sabbat, including important developments which have occurred recently. This cabal, this St. Blaise, seems to be an organization dedicated to filling the Sabbat's logistic needs when it comes to mortal society, supplying things like transport, influence, weapons, and all manner of necessities for Sabbat pacts making incursions into Camarilla territory. I include these events in this report for your Majesty's consideration, as such intelligences could be critical to your interests and those of your domain. Far from the unified enemy they appear to be, the Sabbat is a complex hive of dangerous ideological groups in constant struggle for control of their sect. Where our glorious Ivory Tower may be divided among great kindred like yourself, among domains that may struggle against each other for power and position, the Sabbat is divided by factions of belief and politics, with the individuals involved less central to the conflict than the ideas under contention. When we think of the Sabbat, it is important to remember its origins. They began as a hardcore cabal of anarchs who refused to accept the reality of the Convention of Thorns and returned to the normal order of kindred life. What followed was the spread of a religious faith among these kindred, based on the biblical story of Cain, an ancient myth among vampiric groups that suggests that God created the first of the kindred by cursing the first murderer, Cain, and that kindred proceeded to create children to accompany him in an eternal night. Known to the Sabbat as the second generation. When he left to explore the mysteries of the world God had created, his childer, this second generation, created children of their own, known as the Antediluvians, who resented their sires and yearned for their godlike powers. This resentment would boil into rebellion and diablerie, and the Antediluvians, eventually, would kill the childer of Caine in an uprising. Upon Caine's return, he would find his 13 grandchilder gleefully ruling the domain he had left behind. Rather than annihilate him, he cursed them with powerful weaknesses, which would be reflected in their descendants. These Antediluvians, the Sabbat says, are the founders of each clan of kindred. They believe that these powerful godlike beings control the actions of vampiric elders, and those elders control the actions of their childer, the Ancia and neonates. They claim that destroying these kindred gods is the will of Caine, the first kindred, and their destruction will result in a golden age where the kindred rule over the kind openly, each one living as a king in nights filled with blood and pleasure. In fact, the Sabbat refers to itself as the Sword of Caine, representing the idea that they are an army in waiting for Caine to assume leadership of. And together, they will destroy the hated Antediluvians. Naturally, this myth holds some currency in all kindred societies. See the use of the word Cainite, or the measurement of the potency of a kindred's blood with talk of generation. But the Sabbat has a complex religious narrative grafted onto these ancient stories that spreads deeply within their sect. The faith of these religious zealots isn't a mystery. We've heard much of this dogma screamed at us in pitched battles through the streets of Paris in the past. But how it is played out in the structure of the sect, along with its origins in the Anarch Revolt, is of interest. Shortly after its creation, the Sabbat established a code that expresses their hierarchy and their general ethos in a way similar to a mortal constitution. Known as the Code of Milan, it was created shortly after the creation of the Sabbat, though it didn't gain widespread acceptance in the Sword of Caine until the end of the First Sabbat Civil War. Following a second civil war, the Sabbat came together again to make an addendum to the code in 1933, with at least 50 of the most powerful Sabbat kindred attending. One might think that this change is a sign that points to the chaos that swirls within their ranks. The sect exists in contradiction. It sees itself as an army preparing for a great war to end all wars, while simultaneously often being in a state of internal conflict and anarchy. The Code of Milan seems aimed at fixing this contradiction with laws. The tenets of this code provide a roadmap to the internal political life of the so-called Sword of Caine. It began as a dream of the followers of a path of enlightenment known as the Path of Honorable Accord, and it is split into 3 primary sections and an addendum. The first parts involve the leadership of the Sabbat. Unlike the Ivory Tower's wise inner circle or just to carry it, the Sabbat invests most of its authority in a single kindred, the Regent. From the heights of this throne, the hierarchy of the Sabbat descends into 3 parts. The first is the Clergy, where the Sabbat imitates the structure of the Catholic Church. A council of cardinals, roughly analogous to the Justicars of the Camarilla, are regional leaders of the sect, commanding multiple domains. Beneath them, vampires of great domains on the scale of your majesties are known as archbishops, with numerous bishops serving under them. The 2 other arms of the Sabbat hierarchy underneath the regent are the Black Hand, an organization of elite militants, such as this Redeemer, who engage in special missions for the Sword of Caine. This group of elite soldiers has a great amount of power in the Sabbat, due to their reputation and skill. The other arm of this hierarchy is the Inquisition, a form of internal police who enforce the dogma of the Sabbat to purge heretical ideas as well as find and root out infernalism within the sect. These three groups often find themselves in conflict, sometimes conflict rising to the level of civil war. But this Code of Milan's intention seems to be to stop, or at least somewhat moderate these conflicts. And in this section of the code, that method seems to be highlighting the Auctoritas Ritae. The Auctoritas Ritae are 13 rituals that all members of the Sabbat practice and respect, in contrast to the Ignobilis Ritae, which vary in practice and interest among the many factions of the Sabbat. The Auctoritas Ritae include things like monomacy, the ritual combat these kindred use to settle disputes, or the Valdery, their arcane method of shattering blood bonds from elders. These shared touchstones unite the disparate factions in utility and faith, and underscoring them here seems like a clear effort at obtaining unity. In this section of the Code of Milan, the Sabbat walks a tightrope between its desire to become an army for an existential war for mastery over an endless night, and its origin as a group of anarch rebels. Its structure is ruthlessly hierarchical, but the Sabbat is composed of vampires who are engaging in perpetual rebellion. Here the code seeks to square that circle by highlighting the ideas of equality and respect, which is of course rife with hypocrisy. The idea of honor does a lot of work here, and imagining a world of Cainites immune to subterfuge or dishonesty is almost comical. But there is a reason for this worth remembering. The majority of the Sabbat exist, living under paths of enlightenment, with a variety of moral codes, some of which almost require dishonorable conduct as it is normally understood. These laws are intended to remind each enlightened Cainite that there is a minimum obligation to their allies in the sect. The code also makes clear that all of these other considerations remain secondary to the good of the Sabbat. And then, without irony, refer to Lex Talionis, the blood hunt, as the ultimate form of justice. These rebels find themselves arriving at the same realizations as those of the ancient knight. The truth of kindred life is more akin to gravity than it is to mortal ideology. Its pull is inevitable. There must be order, and that order must be backstopped by the threat of annihilation. That the Code of Milan needs to restate these items so often shows us that these are major problems within the sect. The leadership of the Sabbat seems to seek to unify their efforts, but there is a history to justify this. During the earliest colonization of the New World, the Sabbat established an early dominance in the settlements of the Americas. These kindred were almost entirely young neonates or recent Encia, and after a short time, they began to view themselves differently from the Sabbat in Europe. As those older Sabbat began to migrate to the Americas with the expansion of the colonies, conflicts began to grow between the old and the young, an ironic development for the Sabbat. This would lead to the First Sabbat Civil War, and one of the tactics among both sides would be to not only war against each other, but manipulate Autarchus, Camarilla, and possibly even Moonbeasts against the other faction. This led to the Sabbat going from almost complete control over the United States to losing most of it to the Ivory Tower, as they placed their personal rivalries above the interests of their sect and their faith. The final part once again underscores their ritual, monomacy, as the ultimate method of determining who is right in the Sabbat. In the Camarilla, we often settle interpersonal conflicts with Symbels. But it is interesting how much further the Sabbat extends this to ritual dueling, often resulting in final death for the loser, and in some cases, the victor. This shows how serious these conflicts are in the Sabbat, where the Code of Milan is saying they need to stop coming at the expense of domains themselves. It is interesting that once again, the leadership of the Sword of Caine stresses freedom. Presumably that freedom is maintained by the possibility of a duel to the death through monomacy. This final point of the main Code of Milan is a source of much contention within the Sabbat. As it is usually interpreted, it allows the Black Hand to divert the resources and warriors of entire domains to help achieve their mission. Oftentimes powerful bishops, and even archbishops, need to trust the claim that the Black Hand is acting in the greatest interest of the Sabbat, or is on a mission at all for the Hand. Faith in God is one thing, but faith in a Cainite? It is hard to imagine such trust automatically given to one you barely know. The Sabbat's Inquisition, in particular, has a hard time with this tenet, though its utility is clear. Your elite warriors being able to effectively engage with difficult but important missions is a valuable strategic flexibility. But the Inquisition holds deep distrust for the secrecy and authority of the Black Hand. And who could blame them? What could be more infuriating to a secret police than a door that is closed to them? A secret they are not allowed to know. A world they are preventing from forcing into compliance. And for a sect born in rebellion, what chafes more than a group within it granted sweeping authority with little in the way of accountability? This last part of the Code of Milan is in fact an addendum, only added in 1933 following the Second Sabbat Civil War. That conflict rose between the Tzimitzi and the Lazombre in Mexico, each of them blaming the other for the losses to the Camarilla in the United States during the First Sabbat Civil War. Following the assassination of Regent Gorkrist, the fires of civil war raged within the heartland of the Sabbat for almost 70 years. Formally ending with the signing of this addendum to the Code of Milan. The first portion seeks to address the distrust that factions may hold for each other by allowing the spying on each other with the approval of the sect. The second seeks to give recourse to the members of the Sword of Caine to redress grievances, and one assumes the purpose of this is to avoid the conditions that led to 2 civil wars in the first place, by attempting to address the problems earlier. This leads into the third point, the idea of corrupt leaders, or even non-believers, using the Sabbat as a tool, rather than serving it as an institution. But it clearly places the prosecution and punishment of such leaders in the hands of the upper leadership. The Prisci are a council of advisors to the regent of the Sabbat and his cardinals, and they are made up of the most respected members of the Sword of Caine. The council has no formal power, but the leaders of the sect place a lot of importance on their recommendation. This august body is where the Code of Milan invests its trust to judge the leaders of the sect, and it is a wise decision to have the greatest members of your faith see through any deception or political maneuver against a rival under the cover of this tenet of the code. Quite clever, really. Through these principles, there's much we learn of the Sabbat's internal workings that are often murky. The factions are so numerous, and conflict so quick to rise to violence, it often makes the Sabbat unpredictable. Lazombre sometimes fight with Tzimitzi, the old sometimes war with the young, the Black Hand fights with the Inquisition. Meanwhile, at all levels, vampires fight for positions to become bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and even regents. Among this blood-soaked arena, even individual members of the Sabbat constantly fight each other in monomacy duels to settle personal disputes or to enhance their reputations in the domain. But that isn't the end of it. Beneath all of that is a deep substrata of ideology. The Sabbat has within it many factions representing beliefs about how the sword should proceed to achieve its aims. I'll address these briefly and focus on the main political elements, ignoring the smaller groups. First, there are the Loyalists, who see themselves as heirs to the original Anarchs. They believe that the only way to be loyal to the Sabbat is to follow the original principle of the Anarch movement, that all vampires must be free and ultimately responsible for their own actions. They are strongly opposed to the Code of Milan, as well as an agreement known as the Purchase Pact, which was a non-aggression treaty that marked the pawns of the antediluvians, especially the elders who controlled the Camarilla and the antediluvians themselves, as the true enemies of the Sabbat, and directed the aggression of the Sabbat against them instead of infighting. Everyone who threatened these goals would be declared the target of a blood hunt. After the Loyalists, there are the Moderates, who, while not as radical as the Loyalists, see the modern Sabbat as clogged with rules and regulations that are in contrast to the original spirit of the Anarch Revolt. They support the Purchase Pact, but they oppose several tenets of the Code of Milan. In opposition to both of these groups are the ultra-conservatives and the Orthodox. The ultra-conservatives believe that Gehenna is just around the corner, and that the Sect must be ready for war. In their eyes, even the revised Code of Milan does not go far enough to unite the Sect. The Orthodox Sabbat advocate a strengthening of the religious aspects in the higher echelons of the Sabbat. Believing to do otherwise would invite divine retribution. They advocate a no-quarters attitude towards heretics, as well as a reinforcement of the position of the Pact priests over the Ductus in Sabbat pacts. Between these two sides, there exists a middle ground, known as the status quo. The status quo literally seeks to keep things the way they are, and work within the current systems. They believe that allowing members a looser reign will compromise the security and secrecy of the Sect. And in the background are the Order of St. Blaise, a faction of Sabbat who interact most with human society, often infiltrating themselves into the Catholic Church. The Order, according to my prisoner Eckhart, provides logistic support to the Sabbat through the use of mortal resources, making it one of the most important parts of the Sabbat's war effort. Ironically, because of this group's interaction with the Caine, as well as the tendency of so many of its members to adhere to their humanity, it is a group often held in low esteem by the Sabbat's most zealous members, even though it is crucial to everything they desire. Irony is a cruel mistress, as every kindred learns in their first decades following their embrace. I do wonder if the Sabbat sees the irony, or if they are immune to it, trapped as they are in their zeal. I admit that when the caitiff Eckhart explained these complex rivalries, I was elated to learn our ancient enemy's handicaps. But the more I thought on it, I began to feel great trepidation. With all of these challenges, betrayals, civil wars, and antagonisms that exist within the Sabbat, they still represent an existential threat to many great domains of the Camarilla. A force, still, to be reckoned with. What would they be without these divisions? Without these hatreds for each other? Would they sweep away the Ivory Tower in a storm of fire and blood, were they truly united? Would they have their Gehenna at last, were they to end their infighting? I hope to never learn the truth of it. On another matter, Your Majesty, I have looked into the complaints given by members of the court regarding the Nosferatu Madame Filth. After a thorough investigation, I am happy to inform you that this woman represents no threat, no risk of scandal within your domain. In fact, my investigation has revealed a character comfortable with Camarilla intrigue to be sure, but nothing more exceptional than that. She is as clean as a Nosferatu can be. So I pray Your Majesty no longer need worry about the muttering at court from her failed rivals. I will continue to monitor the situation and keep an eye on her, as with all guests of your domain. But I feel assured that she shall not cause strife. As always, I am at your Majesty's service. Alexander Yates, Sheriff of Paris, Clan Bruja, September 1943.